If you're looking for a little joy in your life, then you're in the right place, as this is Joy for the Journey with Dell Hyssong. Maybe you're looking for peace, joy, contentment. Maybe you feel hopeless. Well, today, Dell will share from the Word of God how you can have all of that and much more. Now, here's your friend and my dad, Dell Hyssong, right here on Joy for the Journey.
Genesis chapter 39. We've been doing a study in the life of Joseph, and I was saying to someone this morning that, I know that all of us know the story of Joseph, but every time I read it, every time I study it, every time that I would preach on this man's life, I learn something new, and God teaches me different things. And so I wanted to come even during this week and just share what God has placed upon my heart, upon my life. And I've got a lot of things that I want to share this morning and some stories that I want to tell you. And we're going to start by reading Genesis 39, beginning at verse 21, and then moving on into the next chapter. He says, "But the Lord was with Joseph." I read that verse again because I've repeated that over and over and over again, because I don't want any of us to ever forget that whether we're on the mountaintop experience or whether we're down in the valleys and the pits, the Lord is with us. Don't ever forget. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. Everywhere that Joseph was placed, God blessed him. God honored him. God prospered him. Verse 23. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, and against the chief of the butlers, and against the chief of bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. Not an accident, not a coincidence. God has a plan. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued in a season in ward. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sad today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there's no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. And it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup unto Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto the place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me. Don't forget me. Remember me. Think of me, when it should be well with thee. And show kindness, I pray thee, unto me. And make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of his house. For indeed I have stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And the uppermost part of the basket was of all manner baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among the servants. And he restored the chief butler unto the butlership again. And he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. Can you imagine? Joseph must have thought, for sure, here's a friend. He's going to remember me. But he forgot him. You know, going through difficulties, going through despair, going through all those things, they're just not fun, are they? And yet all of us go there. I've not liked these last 3 years that my wife has not been well. It's been tough. I don't like being that place. We didn't like it last year just before we were here with you. We had a very bad accident with our motorhome. And you know that somebody ran into it. They hit 3 sides of that motorhome. They're going 100 miles an hour. And we were months without having that coach back while they were repairing it and getting it ready. And while we're down in that valley, if you will, it was hard. It was tough. And because they didn't have insurance, it came out of our insurance, and we had to pay all the motels and all the meals and all those things. You know, when you get into those situations and you're down in the valley, if you will, you have a choice. You can either mumble and grumble and complain, or you can realize that God is with you, that you're going to be okay. And I've oftentimes said, and I've heard it said for many, many years, those kind of things either make us bitter or they make us better. Joseph always came out better. What a man of God. Someone that we can look to and say, wow, that's the kind of person that I want to be like. Here he is. He's put down in the pit by his brothers, sold to Potiphar's house, falsely accused of raping his wife. He gets sent down to prison, and all the time he's remaining faithful to God. And God is prospering him, and God is rewarding him all along the way. And it's just incredible. He becomes a model prisoner now. He's down in prison, becomes a model prisoner. And what do? Now they put him in charge of all the other prisoners as well. When he was in Potiphar's house, he was put over all his house. Is God blessing you? Is God rewarding you? Live like Joseph and see how God can use you in a great and mighty way. We see 3 or 4 things today that I want to look at with you. One, I want us to think about the persecution. You know, most of us expect that if we do something wrong, if we sin, if we've failed God, that we're going to suffer. We think we know that. But when we're doing that which is right, then we don't expect the persecutions that we go through. We just expect to be blessed. And sometimes we still go through those persecutions. I can think about that in so many different ways. I think about my son Richard. We had homeschooled him at 8th grade, but in high school he wanted to play baseball and basketball, and we were still traveling, and I was still pastoring, and so we put him back into our public school. Everybody knew exactly where he stood. They knew where we stood. There were times we were going to Nashville to record, and I remember one of his teachers saying, okay, he can take the week off, but I want a CD when he comes back. But it wasn't like that with all of them. I was doing local television. He also got a lot of persecution. And I remember one particular class, the teacher was an atheist. The teacher absolutely hated what we did and didn't like having Richard even in his class. Richard could never get a good grade from him. Richard was an A, B student. I know that's hard for you to believe, but he was. And in that particular class, That teacher, I mean, if he got a C, he would be very, very fortunate because that teacher just wouldn't give him good grades, no matter what he did. And I remember once that my wife and I went in to talk to the teacher. We thought it was time. We needed to do this. So we went in to talk to the teacher, and he said, well, part of the problem is now he's got all kinds of incompletes. He's not doing his homework. He's not doing the work. And so he's got incompletes. I don't even know. I might have to fail him. We found out which projects and which studies he was saying he was incomplete on. Went back home. Richard kept a whole folder for that class. Not only had Richard done those assignments, but he was graded on those assignments by that teacher. So we had to take those assignments and go back in and say, yes, he did turn these in, and yes, you graded them. And let me tell you something. Persecution isn't fun. That teacher was not pleased, but had to give him the grade that he earned. You know, when you're going down through the pits and the valleys and you're going through persecutions, it can be really tough. And I know that was tough on my son, but I'll tell you this. I think it caused him to grow more than you could ever know, and he's the man that he is today because of that teacher and so many others who he had to just come up against, even as a teenager. God knows what he's doing. I've said over and over, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord's with you. The Lord's with me. The Lord was with my son. And as a result, God blessed and has blessed him in later life. Joseph did that which was right and suffered persecution and mistreatment. And so we see the persecution. We know it's real. It's hard. Nobody likes it. The second thing that we see today is the prison, the actual prison, the dungeon that he was in. And there's several important details that I think we need to consider. First of all, why was he there? Because of a false accusation by Potiphar's wife. He didn't deserve to be there, but that's why he was there. God was with him, and I think Joseph could see that. Joseph knew that he was being blessed in Potiphar's house. Joseph knew that he was blessed down the prison when the head of the prison said, okay, you're in charge of all the other prisoners now. The Lord gave him favor, and the Lord, I believe, gave him inner peace. Gave him inner peace even during the midst of this terrible time. The passage of Scripture says that Joseph was placed in a place of position, a high position. Wow, God was blessing him. And God will bless you, and God will bless me. I believe Joseph had perfect peace. I really do. The first time that my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and she sat in that surgeon's office, and the surgeon could not believe the inner peace that my wife had going through that difficult trial, knowing that surgery was ahead. And she had to get something, and the surgeon turned around to get something behind her. And my wife said to one of my cousins, wow, I just got notification that I've got thousands of people that are praying for me right now. And the surgeon spun around and said, what did you say? She said, there are thousands of people that are praying for me right now. And she said, I have perfect peace. Because she wanted to be a testimony or witness even to that surgeon. I think Joseph had that kind of peace, even though he's going through a very, very difficult time. So what happened? Joseph didn't deserve to be there. We just read the story. The Lord gave him favor, gave him inner peace. And surprisingly, all these prisoners are under his care now, put under his charge. And two of the king's own men were there. The cupbearer, the chief baker, was stationed there in that place. And he had a contact with the king's servants right there. And they both had a dream. And we read this dream just a moment ago in our scripture reading. And Joseph interpreted the dreams, though one was easy to interpret and one was hard to interpret. The chief baker, he should anticipate death. How would you like to have delivered that dream interpretation? Hey, you're going to die. 3 days or so, you're gone. But to the other one, told him that he'd be the cupbearer, the king's cupbearer. Then he said, remember me. Don't ever forget me. See, he'd be the one that would be tasting the king's wine. He would be the one testing his food and watching over his diet. Sometimes he'd be confided with, and Joseph knew that, and that's why he said, remember me, think about me when you're talking with the king. But it's remarkable that he was forgotten. How soon that was. Obviously, Joseph had hoped for an early release. He'd behaved himself. He was good. He'd done nothing wrong in the first place. But the chief baker was put to death, and the butler was made the king's cupbearer, and he forgot Joseph. What's your prison today? Are you in a prison today? Years ago, I don't even know how many years ago it was. I've written about it in my book. But we were in the state of Vermont. We actually do a lot of ministry in Vermont, but we were there years ago, and all of a sudden the back door opened. We'd set all of our equipment up, and we were ready to go, and the back door opened, and there was a wheelchair that was pushed through the door, and there was a man behind it. And I went over, and the one in the wheelchair could not move. That was his prison, I believe. Tough. Just young guy. Couldn't even really lift his arms or do anything. And I reached down and I just put my hand over his hand. His father said, tell him your story. Tell him your story. And that young man from the wheelchair began to tell me his story. He said, I had a great job. Financially, I was doing well. Had a fiance. We were ready to get married. And he said, one winter morning, we had a fresh snow. And he said, I grabbed my toboggan thing, sled, whatever. And he said, I climbed to the top of the hill. And he said, I jumped on that thing and was going down the hill on this fresh snow. And all of a sudden, he said, a tree jumped out in front of me. It's just what he said. And I crashed. And instantly, he said, I was paralyzed. He's telling me this story, and I'm listening intently. And he said, I lost it all. I lost my job. I lost my health. I lost my money. I lost my fiance. She walked away. But he said, I still have God. Still have God. And I thought, wow, if everyone who is going through a difficult time could hear his testimony and how he felt about his relationship with God. That night, we just happened to sing, It Is Well With My Soul, and I love that old hymn and sing it often. And he's sitting there back in that wheelchair. And I couldn't help but look back while we're singing It Is Well With My Soul. And he's mouthing the words, It is well, it is well, it is well with my soul. And as I had a few tears coming down my cheek, and I try not to let people ever see me do that, but it happens, I had to pick up my trumpet and play that last chorus of It Is Well With My Soul while he sat in that wheelchair, his prison, if you will, and sang along with us. It was about 2 years ago. Had not heard or seen from him in all those years. And we were singing in Florida. The door opened up, and in comes the wheelchair. His dad's still right behind him, has cared for him all these years. And he said, do you remember me? Now, I have to confess, there's a lot of people that I can't remember over all the years because we meet a lot of people. But I said, absolutely, you were in Vermont. I said, you know what? I've written about you, one of my chapters in my book, Joy for the Journey. because you gave joy that night when you sang It Is Well With My Soul. And if all I have is the Lord, friends, it's enough. And I trust that you feel the same way in your lives. Well, the third thing I want us to look at is just a pathetic abandonment, because he was abandoned. Everybody had forgotten him. That's the story. Joseph was forgotten. He was not only forgotten by his enemies, he was forgotten by a friend. And it was another abandonment that lasted for 2 more years. Afraid, alone, by himself. Have you ever helped somebody and then they abandoned you? They forgot you. They didn't push you aside. You've helped, you've worked with them, you poured your life into them, and they walked away from you. That's how Joseph must have felt. Absolutely horrible. It can be devastating. Well, we've seen the persecution, the prison, the pathetic abandonment. But I want to say, fourthly, we see a placing of trust in God. He absolutely continued to trust his living God. Because soon that disillusionment was triggered by a man. But Joseph kept his eyes on God. See, so often we get upset and all worried because man forgets us or man fails us. And they fail us all the time. But God never fails us. God will never let us down. I know of a pastor poured his life into his people and into his church. He went away for a vacation, never dreamed that while he was on vacation, they would have a church meeting without him. When he got back from his vacation, he learned that they, one, had voted to dismiss him. They had voted to sell the church building. They had voted to sell the parsonage. And they were closing up shop. He came back from his vacation and he was told they were selling the church, selling his house. He had so much time to get out, and he was going to be done. How would we feel? How would we react if we were abandoned like that? If we were going through something difficult like that? Can I tell you that he's still in love with the Lord? He didn't let man discourage him or put him out. He wouldn't allow that. And in fact, he sends a check to our ministry every single month and never misses. Let me finish by telling a story. You probably all very much aware that Pakistan is a closed country to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's closed. But a couple of years ago, there was a Pakistani pastor who was in touch with us. And he said, I have been watching your Facebook messages. He said, we've been watching those messages. And he said, I was just wondering if we could have a conversation that we could just talk about. Maybe, he said, you could, by way of computer, preach a message, and we could have an interpreter, and we would interpret those messages to our people. He said, let me give you 3 options. He said, 1, we could go out and try to have a big street meeting. I'm a huge street meeting. Get big screens, have food ready for the people. But if you're going to do something like this, this is what it's going to cost you, me. Because, he said, we can't afford the big screens, the PA systems, and the food. But if you'd be willing to do that, we'd like to televise you right here in Pakistan. If you can't afford to hire all those big screens or the food and all that, maybe you could just do it in our church, and if you'd be willing even just $300, we could have food afterwards. They don't have any money. They don't have any food. And if you can't do that, would you just preach to our congregation? Well, that was the beginning of when my wife was sick, and I said, we just need to put it off for a little bit. He said, could you send us a Christmas sermon, a TV Christmas sermon, that we can put on as much closed-circuit television as we can? Now, he knew the risk that he was taking. So we sent over the Christmas message, and he got that on the air as I preached the salvation message and the true meaning of Christmas to a country that is closed to the gospel. Then he was in touch with us. And he said they came in and they burned our church. They burned our houses. And they beat us. He said, how's your wife doing? This is all by Facebook and texts and so on. He said, our church just prayed for your wife. Sent us a video about it. They're all there praying. The only word we understand is Susan, but that's it. The rest is in their language. And then it was around Memorial Day weekend. He wanted us to know that they had killed one of the men in the church. And then, shortly after that, they had another riot, if you will, and they killed another man from their church. And do you know what they're doing during all this persecution? They're moving forward. They're moving forward for God. When some of us would have said, I quit, I give up, they know the Lord is with them, and they're moving forward with the gospel of Jesus Christ and meeting where they can and how they can and not giving up. I think sometimes we forget those who are being persecuted even today. And we think we've got a hangnail and things are really tough. When their lives, their homes are being burnt, they're losing men in their church who are being murdered and put to death. And we think what we're going through is tough. It really isn't. And I'm reminded of Joseph, and it was tough. I can't imagine being in the place he was at, but he knew the Lord was with him.
Thank you for watching Joy for the Journey with Dell Hyssong. Our prayer is that something that has been said has made a difference in your life. We always love to hear from you. You can mail us. The address is Joy for the Journey, P.O. Box 525, Rockport, Maine 04856, or email us at office@joyforthejourney.media. Also, for updates as well as weekly devotionals, make sure to follow Dell on your favorite social media platform. Have a great week, and as always, have joy for the journey.